Stranded on a lonely mountain road with her 6-year-old daughter, Rachel Morgan had nowhere to go and a storm was closing in. Then she spotted an abandoned railroad track leading into the woods. At the end stood an old railroad house, forgotten for decades. Rachel went inside for one reason: to keep her daughter safe. But hidden beneath an old bed were letters from another mother, written generations before Rachel ever arrived. And what those letters revealed would force Rachel to confront a truth about her own life she had spent years trying not to see. Stay with us, because Rachel went into that forgotten railroad house looking for shelter. What she found there gave her something far more important a way forward. Just 6 hours earlier, Rachel Morgan had been standing in her kitchen, staring at a canvas bag on the floor. At 38, Rachel had become very good at making things look normal. There were family photographs on the walls. Sophie's drawings covered the refrigerator. The lawn was trimmed every Saturday. From the street, theirs looked like a good home. But homes can keep secrets. Rachel's husband had never needed to lock a door to make her feel trapped. It happened slowly. First came questions about where she had been, then the passwords, the bank statements, the friends he didn't like, phone calls that lasted too long, purchases that required explanations, $20 at the grocery store, a call to her sister, a cup of coffee she hadn't mentioned. Little by little, Rachel learned to measure her words before speaking them. She called it keeping the peace. For years, she told herself it wasn't bad enough to leave. Marriages were difficult. People had worse problems. Sophie needed both parents. Mostly, Rachel believed she could carry the weight herself. Then, that morning, there was another argument. Nothing unusual. A voice rose. A cabinet door slammed, and Rachel looked across the kitchen. Sophie stood barefoot beside the refrigerator, clutching her worn stuffed rabbit, Clover. The 6-year-old didn't cry. She simply lowered her eyes and became very still. Too still. Rachel knew that stillness. She had been practicing it herself for years. And suddenly, the room seemed to go quiet. Rachel looked at her daughter and understood something she had spent years refusing to see. Sophie had been watching her mother apologize when she had done nothing wrong, watching her check someone else's mood before speaking, watching her become smaller just to keep a house peaceful. Rachel had always told herself, "I stay for Sophie." But standing there that morning, another thought came to her. What if staying is teaching her to become me? That was the moment Rachel made her decision. She waited until the house was quiet. Then she packed only what mattered. Birth certificates, medication, a few clothes, Sophie's blanket, Clover, and the small amount of cash Rachel had quietly saved. Sophie watched from the bedroom doorway. "Mommy." Rachel turned. "Should I pack my school things?" The question nearly broke her. Rachel looked at the little backpack hanging beside Sophie's bed and realized her daughter didn't understand whether they were leaving for a night, a week, or forever. "No, sweetheart," Rachel said softly. "Not today." There was no dramatic goodbye. Rachel took Sophie's hand, walked to the SUV, and drove away. Her older sister, Megan, lived across the state line. Months earlier, Megan had told her, "If you ever need somewhere to come, you don't have to explain. Just come." Rachel hadn't been ready then. Now she was. An hour into the drive, her phone lit up on the passenger seat. Home. Rachel stared at the word. Her foot eased from the accelerator. For years, home had meant everything she believed she was supposed to protect. The phone kept ringing. Rachel almost answered. Almost. Then she looked into the rearview mirror. Sophie was asleep beneath her pink blanket, Clover tucked safely beneath her chin. Rachel let the phone ring until the screen went dark. Then she pressed the accelerator again. By late afternoon, familiar suburbs had disappeared behind them. Small towns gave way to winding mountain roads, old bridges, and miles of forest. Rachel had no job waiting for her. No apartment of her own. No careful plan for rebuilding a life at 38. But for the first time in years, the road ahead frightened her less than the thought of turning around. Then the sky changed. Heavy clouds swallowed the mountains. Rain touched the windshield. Her GPS lost its signal. Rachel passed a faded sign pointing toward an old mining community she had never heard of. The road narrowed. The forest pressed closer, and the SUV shuddered. Rachel looked at the dashboard. "No," she whispered. The engine coughed again. She pressed the accelerator. Nothing. Then the dashboard went dark. Behind her, Sophie stirred. "Mommy." Rachel stared through the rain at a road she didn't recognize. She didn't know it yet, but somewhere beyond those trees lay an abandoned railroad, and at the end of it, a forgotten house that had once sheltered another mother. A woman who, more than half a century earlier, had faced a question Rachel was only beginning to understand. How much should a mother endure before protecting her child means walking away? For several seconds, Rachel did nothing. She kept both hands on the steering wheel and listened to the rain tapping against the roof. "Mommy." Sophie's voice brought her back. Rachel turned around and forced a smile. "It's okay, sweetheart. The car just needs a minute." She tried the ignition again. Click. Nothing. One more time. Click. The silence afterward felt heavier. Rachel checked her phone. No signal. Outside, the afternoon was disappearing faster than it should have. The clouds had lowered over the mountains, turning the forest beyond the windshield into layers of gray. Rachel knew enough not to wander without a reason. But she also knew how cold a dead vehicle could become after dark. She pulled Sophie's coat from the back seat and helped her into it. "Are we walking?" "Just a little." "To Aunt Megan's." Rachel hesitated. "No, sweetheart. We're going to find somewhere dry until the storm passes." Sophie nodded as though that explanation was enough. Children sometimes trust us most when we feel least worthy of it. Rachel packed 2 bottles of water, crackers, a flashlight, the emergency blanket, and her phone into a backpack. She slipped Sophie's pink blanket beneath the straps. Clover stayed in Sophie's arms. When Rachel opened the door, cold rain struck her face. They stepped onto the muddy shoulder. The road curved in both directions and vanished among the trees. No houses, no headlights, no sound of traffic. Only rain. Rachel took Sophie's hand. "Stay close to me." They had gone perhaps 100 yards when Rachel noticed something through the brush. A straight line. Too straight to belong in the forest. She pushed aside a wet branch. There, beneath weeds and fallen leaves, were 2 rusted rails. An abandoned railroad. The wooden ties were dark with age, some nearly swallowed by earth. Ferns grew between them. Moss softened the steel. Rachel remembered the faded mining town sign she had passed before the SUV failed. Maybe the tracks once led there, and where there had been a railroad, there might once have been buildings. Shelter. It wasn't much, but it was something. They followed the tracks. At first Sophie treated it like an adventure, carefully stepping from one wooden tie to the next. Then the rain grew harder. 10 minutes became 20. Sophie stopped talking. Rachel felt the small hand inside hers becoming heavier. "Mommy, I'm tired." "I know." Rachel crouched and zipped Sophie's coat higher. "We'll rest soon, I promise." Sophie looked up at her. "Are we going to be okay?" The question landed differently now. Rachel looked at her daughter's wet hair clinging to her forehead, at Clover's rain-darkened ears. She thought of all the promises she had made that morning without knowing whether she could keep any of them. A safe place. A new beginning. A life where Sophie didn't have to become quiet when someone entered a room. Rachel squeezed her hand. Yes, sweetheart. Her voice trembled, but only once. I'm going to keep you safe. They kept walking. Then Rachel saw something ahead. At first it looked like another shadow among the trees. She stopped. A roof line. Rachel blinked rain from her eyes. There it was again. Straight edges. A chimney. Walls. Come on. She pulled Sophie forward. The building slowly emerged from the forest. It was small and narrow, built close to the tracks. Its weathered boards faded almost silver with age. Vines climbed one wall. Several windows were shuttered. Part of the porch sagged toward the ground. An old railroad section house. It looked as though no family had lived there in half a century. But it was standing. That was enough. Rachel climbed the porch steps and reached for the door. Then she stopped. The weeds around the building were thick. The porch was covered in leaves. But the rusted latch on the door was strangely clean, as though a hand had touched it recently. Rachel looked back toward the tracks. Nothing. Only rain moving through the trees. Sophie pressed against her side. Mommy, I'm cold. Rachel looked down at her daughter. Whatever questions this place held could wait. She wrapped her fingers around the latch. Stay behind me. The metal lifted with a soft click. Rachel pushed. For a moment, the door resisted. Then it opened into darkness. A smell of old timber and cold iron drifted out. Rachel raised the flashlight. The beam crossed a wooden table. A narrow bunk. Tools hanging from the wall. And in the corner, a cast-iron stove. Rachel almost cried at the sight of it. She stepped inside and reached back for Sophie. Neither of them noticed the words carved into the timber beside the stove. Not yet. Nor did Rachel know that beneath one of those old beds were letters written by another mother during a winter long ago. All Rachel knew was that for the first time since leaving home that morning, she could close a door between her daughter and the storm. And for that moment, that was enough. Rachel closed the door behind them. The storm did not disappear. Rain still hammered the roof. Wind moved through the trees with a low, restless sound. And every few moments an old branch scraped across the outside wall. But inside, something changed. For the first time all afternoon, Sophie was out of the rain. Rachel stood with one hand against the door and let herself breathe. Is this somebody's house? Sophie whispered. I don't think anybody lives here anymore. Sophie looked around. How do you know? Rachel almost smiled. I guess I don't. She raised the flashlight. The railroad house was larger than it had appeared from outside, though still modest. A narrow wooden table stood beneath one window. 2 bunks had been built into the opposite wall. Rusted tools hung from square nails. An old kerosene lamp sat on a shelf beside several empty glass jars. Everything was covered in dust, but not destroyed. That surprised her. This wasn't a place someone had abandoned in panic. It felt more like a room that had simply been closed one day and forgotten. Then Rachel turned toward the cast-iron stove. If she could get it working, they might actually make it through the night comfortably. She crouched beside it. The iron was cold beneath her fingertips. She opened the small door and found old ash inside. Mommy! Sophie was pointing at the wall. What does that say? Rachel followed her finger. There were words carved into the timber beside the stove. She wiped away the dust. Keep stove draft open during north wind. Below it, in smaller letters, dry pine catches fast. Rachel stared. Someone had left instructions. Not decoration. Not initials carved by bored teenagers. Instructions. She looked around again, more carefully this time. Near the door, another message had been cut into the wood. 3 short whistles means danger. And beside the window, Never cross East Trestle after heavy rain. Rachel felt a small chill that had nothing to do with her wet clothes. Whoever had lived here had expected someone else to need these words someday. Maybe family. Maybe railroad workers. Maybe strangers. People like them. Rachel searched beside the stove and found a metal bucket containing several pieces of old, dry kindling. Not much, but enough to try. From her emergency kit, she took a lighter. The first flame died. The second caught the edge of the pine, flickered, then nearly disappeared. Rachel remembered the carving. She adjusted the draft. The fire suddenly drew upward. A thin ribbon of smoke vanished into the stovepipe. Then came the soft crackle of burning wood. Rachel sat back on her heels. "Oh, thank God." Sophie smiled. "You did it." Rachel looked at her daughter. "No," she said quietly, glancing at the words carved into the wall. "I think somebody helped us." Within 20 minutes, the room began to change. Rachel hung their wet coats near the stove. She wrapped Sophie in the emergency blanket and placed her on the lower bunk with crackers and water. Clover sat beside her, one damp ear drooping. Sophie held the rabbit toward the stove. "He's cold too. Then we better warm him up." For the first time that day, Sophie laughed. It was small, barely more than a giggle. But Rachel froze for half a second when she heard it. She hadn't realized how much she had missed that sound. Not Sophie laughing in front of cartoons. Not the polite little laugh she sometimes gave adults. This was different. Loose. Unwatched. A child laughing because nobody in the room needed her to be careful. Rachel turned toward the stove so Sophie wouldn't see her eyes fill. Outside, thunder rolled through the mountains. Inside, the old railroad house held. Later, Sophie fell asleep beneath her pink blanket, Clover tucked under one arm. Rachel remained beside the fire. She should have been exhausted. Instead, she felt strangely awake. Now that the immediate danger had passed, she began noticing details she had missed. A child's height marks carved into one door frame. A small horseshoe nailed above the window. A faded calendar fragment behind the table. Someone had raised children here. The thought made the room feel different. Rachel imagined winter mornings, boots drying beside the stove, a father coming home smelling of coal smoke and iron, a mother preparing supper while listening for a train whistle in the distance. Ordinary lives. Ordinary worries. People who had once believed this little house would always be here. Rachel ran her fingers across the edge of the lower bunk. Something moved. She stopped. Pressed again. A narrow wooden panel shifted beneath the bed frame. Rachel crouched. At first she thought it was simply loose. Then she noticed a small recessed pull. A drawer. Hidden beneath the bunk. Rachel glanced at Sophie. Still asleep. She slowly pulled it open. Dust lifted into the flashlight beam. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in faded cloth. Rachel's heartbeat quickened. She lifted it carefully and placed it on the table. The cloth opened around a stack of yellowed envelopes tied with dark string. Letters. Dozens of them. The top envelope had no stamp. Only a name written carefully across the front. Eleanor. Rachel hesitated. These belonged to someone. Opening them felt almost like entering a room without knocking. But then she noticed something else. On the underside of the drawer, almost invisible in the darkness, someone had written a sentence in pencil. The letters were faint. Rachel brought the flashlight closer. If the railroad closes, don't let them take the box beneath the floor. Rachel read it twice. Then a third time. The box beneath the floor. She slowly looked down. The floorboards beneath her boots were old and uneven. One of them, near the table, had scratches along its edge, as though it had been lifted before. Rachel's eyes returned to the letters. The storm continued outside. Sophie slept peacefully only a few feet away. Rachel should have left the past alone. She knew that. But something about Eleanor's name, the children's marks on the doorway, and those instructions carved beside the stove had begun to feel strangely personal. Another mother had lived here. Another mother had kept children warm in this same room. And for reasons Rachel could not yet understand, she had hidden something beneath the floor and left behind a warning about it. Rachel reached for the first letter. The paper trembled slightly between her fingers. Then, from somewhere outside the house, came a sound. Rachel stopped. Not thunder, not wind. A sharp metallic noise. Once, then silence. Rachel slowly turned toward the door. For several seconds, nothing happened. She told herself it was a branch striking the old railroad tracks. It had to be. Still, she crossed the room and checked the latch. Secure. When she returned to the table, the letter was waiting where she had left it. Rachel sat down beside the fire. She unfolded the brittle page. And as she began to read Eleanor's words, Rachel had no idea that the woman who had written them more than half a century earlier had once faced a choice frighteningly similar to her own. Nor did she know that the mysterious box Eleanor had tried so hard to protect was no longer beneath the floor. The letter began without ceremony. No grand confession. No explanation of the box beneath the floor. Just a date. January 14th, 1962. Rachel moved closer to the stove. Eleanor's handwriting was careful, though the ink had faded with time. Cold again tonight. Samuel says the North Line may close if the snow keeps coming. Daniel coughed through breakfast, but Ruth made him laugh. I suppose children can still find reasons to laugh when grown people have forgotten how. Rachel stopped. She looked towards Sophie. Her daughter was asleep beneath the pink blanket, Clover tucked against her cheek. Only an hour earlier, Sophie had laughed beside this same stove. Rachel continued reading. The letters told no extraordinary story. There were notes about firewood, a leaking roof, railroad schedules, children with winter colds, a husband coming home late, meals stretched farther than they should have been. Yet between those ordinary details, Rachel began to see Eleanor, not as a name on an envelope, as a woman, a mother, someone who had stood in this room when the wind screamed outside and wondered whether she was making the right choices for her children. Rachel opened another letter, then another. Weeks passed between some of them, and slowly, Eleanor's words changed. The railroad had become dangerous. Men had been injured. Paychecks arrived late. Families were leaving the mining community. But Eleanor's deepest fear wasn't poverty. It was what her children were learning from watching the adults around them endure things simply because they had always endured them. Then Rachel found a passage that made her stop breathing for a moment. Children learn what home means by watching what we are willing to accept inside it. Rachel lowered the page. The fire crackled softly. For years, she'd said the same sentence whenever someone asked why she stayed. I stay for Sophie. She had believed it. Even when she stopped calling friends, even when she began hiding small purchases, even when the sound of a car pulling into the driveway could tighten something inside her chest, she had told herself sacrifice was part of being a mother. But what if Sophie had been learning the wrong lesson from that sacrifice? Rachel remembered the kitchen that morning. The slammed cabinet. Sophie beside the refrigerator. Those lowered eyes. That terrible stillness. Rachel had recognized it because it belonged to her, too. A tear slipped down her cheek. She wiped it away, but another followed. I'm sorry, she whispered. Sophie stirred, but did not wake. Rachel moved to the bunk and gently pulled the blanket higher around her daughter's shoulders. For the first time, Rachel allowed herself to consider something she had never been able to say aloud. Maybe leaving had not destroyed Sophie's home. Maybe the home had already been broken in ways no visitor could see. And maybe walking away was not the moment Rachel failed her daughter. Maybe it was the first moment she had truly protected her. She returned to the table. Near the bottom of Eleanor's next letter was another line. There comes a time when staying and protecting are no longer the same thing. Rachel closed her eyes. She had spent the entire day believing she was running away. Away from her marriage. Away from the house. Away from the woman she had become. But sitting inside a forgotten railroad house, reading the words of a mother who had lived more than half a century before her, Rachel began to see the road differently. She wasn't only running from something. She was carrying Sophie toward something. Toward mornings without fear. Toward a room where the little girl could speak without first checking someone's face. Toward a life Rachel could not yet picture, but could finally believe might exist. Outside, the storm began to weaken. Rachel looked around the old room. The stove. The bunks. The children's height marks beside the doorway. The instructions carved into the timber. This house had not survived because it was beautiful. It had survived because someone had built it with care. Someone had thought about the people who might come after. Rachel looked down at the remaining letters. One envelope was different. No date. No name. Across the front, Eleanor had written only 4 words. For whoever finds this. Rachel's fingers rested on the envelope. Then her eyes drifted toward the scratched floorboard near the table. The hidden box. The warning. And the strange metallic sound she had heard outside. For the first time that night, Rachel understood that Eleanor had left behind more than memories. She had left something unfinished. And somehow, Rachel had walked into the middle of it. Rachel held the envelope for a long time. For whoever finds this. 4 words. Nothing more. Yet, somehow, they felt heavier than all the letters she had read before. She carefully opened the brittle flap. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Eleanor's handwriting was shakier here, as though she had written it in a hurry or perhaps with hands tired from years of work. If you are reading this, then the house has lasted longer than I expected. Rachel glanced around the room. The old stove glowed softly. Rain still whispered against the roof, but the violence had gone out of the storm. Maybe you came because you knew us. Maybe you came because the railroad brought you. Or maybe you were simply in need of shelter. Rachel stopped. Her eyes moved toward Sophie. Simply in need of shelter. It felt impossible that words written decades ago could describe this night so perfectly. She continued, If this house kept you warm, then it has done what we hoped it would do. Rachel pressed her lips together. Eleanor explained that the section house had once served more than the railroad family who lived there. During hard winters, workers stranded along the line had slept on its floor. Families caught between mining camps had been given food. Once, during a blizzard, 7 people had crowded around the little cast-iron stove and waited 3 days for the tracks to reopen. The house had never belonged only to them. It had been a place where people stopped long enough to survive. Then Eleanor mentioned the box. There are records beneath the floor that should not disappear with the railroad. Names, photographs, pay records, letters, proof that ordinary families lived here, worked here, raised children here. Rachel looked toward the scratched floorboard. If the company closes the line, someone may come for them. If they do, I hope they understand that those papers belong to more than one family. Rachel folded the letter carefully. Now she understood. The box wasn't treasure, at least not the kind people usually imagined. It was memory. Rachel moved toward the table and knelt beside the scratched board. She slipped her fingers into the narrow gap and pulled. The board lifted easier than expected. Beneath it was a shallow compartment. Rachel raised the flashlight. Empty. She stared. A pale rectangle remained in the dust where something had once rested. The box had been there. Someone had removed it. Rachel remembered the clean door latch. Then the metallic sound outside. A knot tightened in her stomach. She searched the compartment carefully. Nothing. Then her fingers brushed against the wooden support beneath the floor. There was another opening. Smaller. Almost invisible. Rachel reached inside and pulled out a thin envelope wrapped in oilcloth. Unlike the others, this one was addressed to Eleanor's children, Daniel and Ruth. Rachel hesitated before opening it. Then she read, Eleanor wrote that she did not know what would become of the railroad or the little house beside it, but she wanted her children to remember one thing. 4 walls can keep out rain. A stove can keep out winter. But neither one makes a home. Rachel's eyes blurred. Home should be the place where you do not have to be afraid to return. Rachel stopped reading. For a moment, she couldn't move. All day, she had been asking herself the same question. Did I do the right thing by leaving? But Eleanor's words gave her a different question. A better one. Rachel looked at Sophie sleeping peacefully. What kind of home do I want my daughter to remember? Not the address. Not the furniture. Not the family photographs arranged carefully for visitors. What would Sophie remember feeling? Fear, silence, or safety? Rachel lowered herself onto the floor. The tears came quietly. Not the tears of someone falling apart. The tears of someone finally putting down something she had carried too long. I'll do better, she whispered toward the sleeping child. Not, I'll make everything perfect. Not, I'll never be afraid again. Just, I'll do better. And for the first time, that felt possible. Morning arrived slowly. The storm had passed, leaving the forest washed clean beneath a pale sky. Rachel packed Eleanor's letters carefully into the waterproof sleeve in her backpack. She left everything else exactly where she had found it. Before waking Sophie, she stood beside the stove and touched the carved instructions one last time. Someone had written those words for a stranger they would never meet. Someone had prepared this house for a future they would never see. And somehow, Rachel and Sophie had become part of that future. Rachel had arrived believing she had lost her home. Now she understood she had been given something more important than an address. A chance to decide what the next one would feel like. She woke Sophie, helped her into her coat, and opened the door. Cold morning air entered the room. Ready, Rachel asked. Sophie took her hand. Ready? They stepped onto the old railroad tracks and started back toward the road. They had walked less than a quarter mile when Rachel suddenly stopped. There, pressed deep into the wet earth beside the tracks, were footprints. Large, fresh, and they were heading in the opposite direction. Back toward the railroad house, Rachel stopped so suddenly that Sophie nearly walked into her. Mommy! Rachel didn't answer. Her eyes stayed on the footprints. They were too clear to be old. Deep heel marks pressed into the wet earth beside the railroad ties, the edges still sharp from the storm-softened mud. A man's boots, Rachel guessed, or at least someone much larger than her. The tracks continued past them in the direction they had just come from. Toward the railroad house, Rachel felt Sophie's fingers tighten around hers. Are those ours? No, sweetheart. Sophie looked behind them. Rachel did too. The railroad disappeared between dripping trees. Nothing moved. No voices. No footsteps. Only water falling from branches. Then Rachel noticed something near the rail. A crushed coffee can. Modern. Bright aluminum beneath the mud. It hadn't been there for decades. Someone had walked this line recently. Maybe yesterday. Maybe this morning. Rachel thought about the clean latch on the railroad house. The missing box beneath the floor. The metallic sound outside during the night. For a moment, every instinct told her to go back. She wanted answers. Who had taken the box? Were the photographs safe? Did whoever left these footprints know about Eleanor? And had someone been outside while Rachel and Sophie slept? She took one step toward the house, then stopped. "Mommy." Sophie's voice was small. Rachel looked down. Her daughter was watching her face, waiting. Rachel knew that look. For years, Rachel had done the same thing, studying another person's expression before deciding whether she was safe. And suddenly, she understood what this moment was really asking of her. Not whether she could solve the mystery, whether she could trust herself. Rachel had spent years second-guessing her own instincts. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe she misunderstood. Maybe things weren't really that bad. Maybe she should wait. Maybe she needed more proof. There was always another reason not to act. But Eleanor's words returned to her. There comes a time when staying and protecting are no longer the same thing. Rachel looked once more toward the railroad house. Then she turned away. "Nothing we need to worry about right now," she said. She adjusted Sophie's backpack. "Keep holding my hand." And they walked. Rachel did not know who had made those footprints. She did not know whether the person was dangerous. She simply knew that Sophie was cold. They had limited food, and safety was somewhere ahead. For once, that was enough. They walked for nearly an hour. The abandoned railroad seemed longer in daylight. Sophie began dragging her feet. Rachel carried her for part of the way, one arm beneath her daughter's legs, the other balancing against the slick ties. At 38, Rachel was not old. But exhaustion has a way of adding years all at once. Her shoulders burned. Her wet boots rubbed against her heels. Still, every time she thought she couldn't carry Sophie another step, she remembered the little girl standing barefoot beside the refrigerator. And she kept going. Eventually, the rails curved toward the road. Rachel saw the SUV first, then something better, a pickup truck. An older man in a work jacket stood beside it, examining her vehicle. Rachel nearly cried. He looked up when he saw them. "Ma'am, is this your car?" Rachel nodded. "My daughter and I got stranded?" The man glanced at Sophie, then toward the dark clouds retreating over the mountains. "You two spend the night out here." Rachel looked back toward the trees. "Something like that." He gave them a ride to a gas station several miles away, where Rachel finally found a cell signal. Her phone came alive almost immediately. Missed calls, messages, notifications. Rachel stared at the screen. For a few seconds, the old fear returned. The urge to explain, to apologize, to make everything calm again. Then another name appeared. Megan. Rachel called her sister. Megan answered before the first ring had finished. Rachel. Rachel tried to speak. Nothing came out. "Rachel, where are you?" That was when her voice finally broke. "I left." There was silence on the other end. Not judgment. Not surprise. Just a breath. Then Megan said the words Rachel needed more than she knew. "Okay. Tell me where you are." "I'm coming." Rachel closed her eyes. No questions. No lecture. No demand for an explanation. Just, "I'm coming." Sophie leaned against her side. Rachel wrapped an arm around her. For years, she had confused control with concern and silence with peace. Now, sitting beneath the fluorescent lights of a roadside gas station with mud on her boots and almost nothing to her name, Rachel experienced something different. Help that asked for nothing in return. And it felt almost unfamiliar. That evening, after Sophie was safe at Megan's house and asleep in a clean bed, Rachel placed Eleanor's letters on the kitchen table. She could have put them in a drawer. She could have told herself the railroad house was someone else's problem. But Rachel had spent enough of her life looking away from things because facing them felt difficult. Not anymore. She searched for the historical society in the county where they had been stranded. Then she picked up the phone. When a woman answered, Rachel took a breath. "My name is Rachel Morgan," she said. "I found something near an abandoned railroad line." She looked at Eleanor's letters. "I think someone has been trying to preserve it for a very long time." Rachel paused. "And I think it's time somebody listened." 3 days later, Rachel stood beside the abandoned railroad again. Only this time, she wasn't alone. A county historian named Thomas Reed walked ahead of her with a camera and field notebook. Behind him came 2 preservation volunteers and a retired railroad engineer who had spent most of the drive talking about branch lines that disappeared before Rachel was born. Megan had stayed home with Sophie. Rachel had almost stayed too. Part of her wondered whether returning was a mistake. But when the old section house appeared through the trees, that feeling disappeared. "There it is," Rachel said. Everyone stopped. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Thomas slowly lowered his camera. "My God," he whispered. They entered carefully. The stove was still there. The bunks. The height marks beside the doorway. The survival instructions carved into the timber. Thomas ran his fingers just above the words without touching them. People didn't carve things like this for history. He said they carved them because somebody might need them. Rachel understood that better than anyone. She showed them the hidden drawer, then the empty compartment beneath the floor. Thomas photographed everything. Over the following weeks, records began filling in the missing pieces. The section house had once belonged to a railroad serving several mining communities in the mountains. Eleanor's husband, Samuel, had maintained miles of track. Their children, Daniel and Ruth, had grown up beside the line. But the mystery of the missing box remained. Until Thomas called Rachel one afternoon. "We found someone," he said. His name was Henry Cole. He was 74 years old, and Eleanor had been his grandmother. Rachel met Henry at the Historical Society. He arrived carrying a battered metal box. The moment Rachel saw it, she knew. Henry placed it gently on the table. "I've been looking for that house for years," he said. His mother, Ruth, had told him stories about growing up beside the railroad. After the line closed, the family scattered, and the exact location of the house slowly disappeared from memory. Henry had eventually found it. And yes, the footprints had been his. So had the clean door latch. Months earlier, worried that the roof might collapse, Henry had removed the metal box from beneath the floor. Inside were photographs, payroll books, railroad badges, maps, and handwritten records of families who had once lived along the line. He hadn't taken a treasure. He had been trying to save one. Rachel reached into her bag. "I think these belong with it." She placed Eleanor's letters on the table. Henry stared at